Welcome to Age of AI, Politics, Law, and Society, hosted by Medlir Mema, Chris Lamont, and Young Diogenes, in association with the Global Governance Institute in Brussels.
Hi, I'm your host, Medlir Mema. A recent Goldman Sachs report noted that the promise of generative AI technology to transform companies, industries, and societies is leading tech giants and beyond to spend an estimated $1 trillion on capital expenditure in coming years, including significant investments in data centers, chips, other AI infrastructure, and the power grid. But this spending has little to show for it so far. The question naturally becomes whether, as some have put it, this large spend will ever pay off in terms of AI benefits and returns, and the implications for economies, companies, and markets if it does, or even if it doesn't. The answer, as always, is never straightforward. To make sense of these issues, I am delighted to welcome to our show today Maria Santacaterina, CEO of Santacaterina Consulting, a global strategic leader and board executive advisor, who has worked in the industry and has over 25 years of international experience. An in-demand speaker, Maria is also the author of a recently published book, Adaptive Resilience: How to Thrive in a Digital Era, where she explores the question of how businesses can build a more inclusive, equitable, and sustainable digital future. Maria, welcome to Age of AI.
Oh, thank you so much. I'm delighted to be here. Thank you, Medlir.
Well, as you heard in my opening remarks, there are growing concerns about the sustainability of the current trajectory in terms of investments in AI, and more specifically in generative AI. Given that little has materialized in terms of profits for these companies. And actually, in preparation for the podcast, just before we got on air, I noticed that you had also posted something to this. So with your permission, I'm going to quote you in one of your LinkedIn posts. Here's what you say. From an economic standpoint, generative AI will not create jobs at a granular level. On aggregate, infrastructure build-outs and destructive uses may show up momentarily in GDP as growth, but it's not sustainable. No one is achieving enhanced return on investment. With further automation, consumers are becoming scarce, and financiers, banks, and VCs are getting jittery. Now, exactly what are your views on this moment in generative AI? Hype or real?
It's a very good question. I think it's a mixture. I think it's both. There's hype and there's real. And in this sense, I think the claims of what AI can do are a little bit inflated in terms of the technical capabilities. And it's real because the effects on society at a social level, at an individual level, if we take it right the way down to the microeconomics of it all, are real. And they are not looking good at the moment. That's not to say that the technology can't be used in a more beneficial manner. I do believe that it can be. But I think this race to deploy it without thinking critically about it is a bit problematic.
Well, here's a question I follow up on that, because I'm hearing two different things. And one thing, there is this fear of whether returns on investments will actualize. But then there is this, as you just said towards the end of your answer, that it's not so much about that, but rather that we're rushing towards implementation of AI without thinking, without the guardrails being in place. Those seem to me like two different types of concerns and questions. So the first one from an economic standpoint is it likely that we are going to see some meaningful return, so to speak, both economic, financial, but as well as societal returns on this huge focus on AI and generative AI in particular? But then the second part of the question I want to turn to towards the end of our podcast today is, what does that mean for our society? So I just want to stay on the first part of that, and that is, again, you seem to raise questions about the possibility of actually even getting returns on this $1 trillion plus investment on generative AI. The Goldman Sachs report seems to also indicate that we're investing a lot, but we're not seeing a whole lot coming out of that. Could you clarify that for us? What is your view? Why are you pessimistic or suspicious or doubtful on whether these investment will actually ever be returned
Well, I'm skeptical.
Yeah, right. So
based on experience. I'm skeptical based on experience. In this sense, we run business on a 3 to 5 year cycle. It depends when the elections fall, to be frank. If there's a change of government, how will the policy change, how that's going to affect my decision making, my strategy, my priorities, and so forth. That's basically how it works. And of course, this being the year of elections, we're going to see some very interesting times. And we're already seeing voters voting with their feet quite literally, because there is a swing to the extremes, one direction or the other, but nonetheless, people are protesting. Now, how that gets translated into business, automation is not the answer. Not in this short-term cycle. And then you have the additional pressures, market cap being the rule, the paradigm that governs almost every decision that is made. And you can see it everywhere. To give an example, my own industry, the luxury industry, for instance, is playing a game of revolving doors. CEOs are being exited because the market cap falls, because the analysts don't like the results, because the turnaround isn't happening quickly enough. But guess what? Automation is not going to produce revenue growth. It's not going to manufacture consumers. So if you zoom out a little bit and you look at it from a macro perspective, we've had COVID, we've got wars, we've got cost of living, we've got escalating energy prices. And on top of that, we have AI, which is using a lot of power. And that's only going to make things worse. So if we are looking to automation and the substitution of human beings in the workplace, we will find that we've got cookie cutter rational agents and the artificial ones, which are not going to deliver on the promise that is being touted in the media. So in that sense, it's hype. The reality is that if you as an individual can't get a job, so just to go back on the second point, back to the micro element, if you can't get a job, then you can't feed yourself, can't clothe yourself, can't get a house, you can't spend. And if you don't spend, no business is going to succeed. It doesn't matter if you're talking about discretionary goods or basic necessities. So from a government perspective, if you zoom out again to the macro level, because it's one and the same problem, they are finding that public services are faltering and they haven't got the means to sustain them. So it all goes back to the same thing. Is automation the answer to our problems? I would suggest not, in the sense that everything is geared towards this 3 to 5 year business cycle, broadly speaking, and it's insufficient time. This technology is immature.
So I hear both a normative concern about it as well as a practical one. The one that you say is born by your experience in the business world, but the other one, there's a sense of the ethics of this. So A, it may not be able to deliver the gains that we think it will, but B, the kinds of gains or the kinds of benefits that we think it may actually deliver for society are not the ones that are necessarily desirable.
Well, they're not materializing just yet. I don't say that they won't, but at the moment, the way in which the technology has been conceived, the way it's being developed, the way it's being deployed, actually, more importantly, it's not conducive to beneficial outcomes in the short term, which is what everybody expects. Everybody thinks you can automate processes and you push a button and hey presto, you have revenue growth, for example, and higher profits. Well, it doesn't quite work like that. Right. So what I'm saying is the costs are not being fully accounted for. And technical efficiency or reducing headcount does not equate to cost saving. And that's the whole problem anyway with the way that GDP is measured. And you can go right the way back to the late 1920s, early 30s when it was first invented by Kuznets. And he himself said, he was the inventor, he said, this is not a measure of human health and well-being. And quite frankly, if you don't measure human health and well-being, you do not have a thriving economy. And we have seen that over the last 100 years. But the mentality that we are using 21st century technology, arguably, but with a 20th century mindset. And the two things are a little bit contradictory. They don't quite match.
So you meet as CEO of a consulting company, you meet with business leaders all the time. What concerns are you hearing from them? And then what is generally your advice to them? So this is going to be free advice to business leaders who listen to the podcast. But what are you hearing from them in terms of concerns? What are the questions they're asking you? And what is generally your advice, the insight you give them?
Well, because of the pressures that are in play at the present time, they want more automation. And they want the automation to deliver better results, business results, quickly. But they don't really exist. And so I try to ask them politely, nicely, to take a big step back and to look at their business, their organization, and to identify what their purpose is today, and then tomorrow. What will it be tomorrow? Because unless you're thinking long term, unless you're encompassing multiple generations, everybody's talking about 5 generations in the workplace, but that's not really true, because youngsters are finding it difficult to get into the workplace. And if you're 40 plus, well, you're out. So there is something quite bizarre happening in that sense. But my whole responsible innovation framework is a multi-tiered approach. It's multifaceted. It's looking at the whole rather than the parts. And I think the big mistake that is made by many companies is to jump straight to the technology. It's the solution. We've got to hurry up because it's FOMO or FOBO. What I mean is fear of missing out or fear of becoming obsolete. But in reality, and in practical terms, we're just automating obsolete or obsolescent processes. And that's what I tell them. And they don't like that at all, because they think, what are you talking about? Surely more digitalization, more data, more speed. And I go back to Navy SEALs motto, which is quite interesting one. Less haste, more speed. So let's think about it critically. Let's try to take a more balanced approach, a more nuanced approach. Let's think in a more sophisticated way, if you like. We human beings have intelligence and we reason through things. And I try to bring that back into the frame, which sounds like a simple task, but actually it's not. Not when you constantly hear media reports about how well everybody else is doing. But I question that. I always question what the superficial results appear to say. What's really going on behind the headlines? And you'll find that many CEOs are struggling. They're struggling to meet shareholder demands, investor demands, stakeholder demands, more generally speaking, consumer pressures as well. And if you're in the unfortunate position of being a CEO today, you are in the firing line. And that's not fair. Obviously, it's not fair, but that is how the market is working at the moment.
Well, yeah, it'll be interesting to see how many people are sympathetic to CEOs generally. I know that you would, you're working
well,
with
I have
them,
to be,
so you understand. No, you understand.
Well, myself, and I work with CEOs. Right, no, I'm particularly sympathetic because I understand their pain.
That's what I'm saying. At the human level, you understand that there seems to be this desperate need to just bring AI onto everything. But as you pointed out, there's much to be realized. And in fact, you're pretty direct in terms of your claims, where you say like that there's a lot of false claims by manufacturers of, especially generative AI. You call them relentless in this propagation, these false claims rather. And but you said that nevertheless, adverse consequences of individuals, businesses, and society are non-trivial. What do you mean by that?
Well, my approach is always to say, okay, what is the worst possible case scenario? What difficulty can we potentially face? And if you start from that point, if you're looking at risks, for example, and you take a much broader and a deeper perspective, then you have a better chance of actually designing a system that is a socio-technical system with a big emphasis on the S, because that's where your value is going to be generated. And if you look at it as a communication system, a facilitator, if you will, for people to be more autonomous, more empowered, exercise human agency, you will find that you can innovate, because the innovation is not technology. The innovation is always going to be the human factor. And that's where people get it wrong. Ideas come from people. It's the expansiveness of the human mind. It's the human imagination that delivers results, that delivers innovation. The machinery is the tool. But we seem to live in this hype bubble at the moment, whereby we are being told that it's the technology that does the innovation. But if you think about it and how the technology works, it takes facts, they are compressed. In the process, we're losing meaning, to put it mildly, and then an output is generated. But if that output is then not interpreted using human intelligence, then you're going to end up with the wrong results. And so that's why, back to your earlier question, is it hype or is it real? And I say it's real because it's happening now because of the effects. We don't need AGI and we don't need ASI to have, problems. We've already got them. But we have to face up to the elephant in the room. And I think that's the hardest thing for people to face up to. They don't want to because it's not cool. It's not cool to face the truth.
One of the numbers is thrown around is this early, relatively speaking, 2018, I think, study by McKinsey that estimated, I think, $18 trillion worth of economic bonanza a fallout that would come from investments in AI. And a lot of this investment is happening partly motivated by that thinking. How do you feel about that? Do you feel that's just that estimation perhaps in the short term may not be realized? Or what do you make of those numbers?
Well, it's partly the misconception of what this technology is and what it isn't. So what I mean is, at the moment, there is a philosophy that more data, more compute power, and we are going to get some revelation. And that's not true, because look at it in this sense. What are we putting into the machines? We're putting in data. Data from where? From the past. Now, in a complex adaptive system with the dynamics that are at play, there's no scientific basis to say that the past is going to inform the present or the future. So if you take that viewpoint, then building out these mega infrastructures, this mega gigantic computer that Altman is building out with Nadella, or I don't know, building more powerful chips or whatever, but what are you actually processing? And I asked this question and everybody's dumbfounded. Well, data, of course, we're going to make better use of our data, but if the data is full of redundancies, inconsistencies, flaws, mistakes, errors, duplications, you name it, name any company that has perfect data. I don't think it exists, or government, or anybody really, because we human beings, we are dynamic, we change. You and I have a conversation today. We may feel differently about it tomorrow, but that's our prerogative because we're moving forward. We're not moving backward. Just look at the aging process. So it's counterintuitive to say that we should be looking in the rearview mirror. And I think it's dangerous in today's context. So if you look at the cycles of history, the long arc of human history, we repeatedly have introduced new technologies. They have caused havoc in the economy and society at large, and then somehow we get over it and we move forward. So I am optimistic. I'm a cautious optimist, and I'm full of hope that we can get this right. But it's going to take concerted efforts to really pull back the curtains, as it were, pull back or destroy the veil of ignorance that is now being automated around us and say, this has to stop. We have to draw a line here. And what is the right way forward? And that's why I was saying that we can't wait for legislation, regulation to be implemented or researchers to attest to any harms, because it's too late. You only get one shot at life. And the human lifespan has value to it. Not the actuarial formula that says you can't have the healthcare because you're only expected to live for 10 years. I don't mean in that sense. I mean real value. The potential of every single human being is completely undervalued, and it has been ignored for centuries. Now that we've got here and we have this technology and we have sufficient knowledge, not complete knowledge, but sufficient knowledge, why don't we use these tools in a more effective way to benefit us, to support us in our endeavors, to go back to scientific truth, to explore and discover and learn and move forward? And my whole drive is the forward momentum. So if I'm involved with a company, whatever I do, I always try to move the company forward, move the organization forward, never back, because you can't go back. The past is the past, full stop. You can learn from it. You can certainly analyze it, but it should not condition your decision-making processes to the extent that it does today. And with automation, there's another big problem that we have, because it's aggregated data. And it hides a multitude of sins. So let's say, for example, the machine focuses on the wrong pockets of data in your process and it delivers the wrong output. You could be easily swayed by it, and it can look plausible, and you might make the wrong decision, and it's too late when the wrong outcome is delivered. So I always like to say you have to prepare for the worst and hope for the best. And what I mean by that is that you need to create adaptive resilience within the organization and leverage the intelligence of your people and the potential of your people to move forward alongside developing the technology. So it's not an either or investment. It's both. At the moment, we've only got CapEx in tech. So at macro level, you've got big infrastructure projects going on, or the big tech companies participating with governments and so forth. At the micro level, you have an imposition of this technology in handheld devices that most people have. Right. And it's preventing people from thinking because of this algorithmic hyper-persuasion that's going on. And that's another issue. So you have to look at the whole picture, you as a company, and decide how it is you're going to impact society, how you're going to develop your future. Because after all, society is your future. You don't have customers, you don't have a business.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. Is it too late for these companies to make the necessary changes? You mentioned that you were optimistic. We seem to have settled on a particular model over the last 5 years, and led by the big tech companies. And others are following out of fear, as you said, either missing out or obsolescence altogether, of just becoming obsolete. And so just everybody's following. So there's a process of bandwagoning. So going back also to your experience talking to business leaders, how much willingness is there to step back? How much willingness is there to reconsider and to adapt to the kinds of things that you're talking about? Is it too late to make the necessary changes?
It's never too late to make changes, but it is an uphill battle. If I say you've got to take a step back and you've got to change your thinking about this, that's a difficult message to deliver because everybody else is doing exactly what you say.
Right.
Let's just take a big step back. So this whole thing that has now happened, the catalyst for it was COVID, where there was an artificial lockdown and everything stopped. And so there was a necessity somehow to continue with business. And because of that, let's say, hiatus in our history. And then, of course, with the advent of the early release of ChatGPT and this illusion that a machine can talk to us like human beings can, which it can't, we've ended up in this situation now where everybody is caught up in the hype. And they only believe that the only way forward is how to use the technology better. But I'm saying something a little bit more nuanced. And I'm saying, do you need that technology for that reason? And if yes, why? And if not, then how can we do it differently? And unless we have a more varied approach to the use of this technology, then we can't really shape and influence the way that it's being developed in a way that can be sustainable. And so from a systemic thinking point of view, variety beats variety in the sense that you need different approaches, also in governance terms, so that you can actually create stability within the system. So the ever-elusive dream of economic stability, so that you can actually project forward and have long-term investments, which business would like to do. I'm quite convinced of that. But they feel unable to because they have, on the other hand, to contend with that short-term cycle, that 3 to 5 year cycle that we were speaking of earlier. And even governments, they're constrained by it. And so who is driving, or what, I should say, is driving that cycle? You can't compete with an algorithm. And CEOs are facing that problem today because consumers have gone. So affluent consumers are not buying. The middle class is being destroyed. The working class is disenfranchised. So you have a problem. And you're seeing the cracks all the way through society. And that's a huge concern. And I don't think we can tackle it with automation.
Well, it seems that the problems you're also pointing to, though, seem to be bigger than just big tech. You're pointing to historic trends. You're talking about consumer preferences, consumer demands. You're talking about shifts in the composition of the populations, both in terms of economic classes. How much can big tech and just generally tech do in this direction?
Well, they're exploiting a moment in history.
They're exploiting, but the question is, again, let's say that they say, we understand what you're saying, we accept that. But it seems a lot of this is government policy. The governments, whether it could be tax policy, whether it could be, again, development policies, how much can the big tech do in this direction?
Well, I think at the end of the day, it comes down to the individual. If you are Altman, you have a choice. You can do the right thing, or you can do the not so right thing. Okay. It's your choice. You're leading an entity that is very powerful today. And there have been others before him. So if you take Steve Jobs, for instance, he decided that he was going to aim for truth and beauty. So he made the laptop beautiful, and he demanded that it would be beautiful, and then the rest was history. You can make that same change today. You can stop producing harm. So no good going around the world and doing the oh my God, the threat is nigh and the end of the world is nigh and we need to regulate. That's just useless. You need to take action.
So you're talking here about the Sam Altman's double, like a two-step dance in a way, that where on one hand he says, listen, this is really dangerous, but we're going to continue unless you regulate us. And what you're saying here is that no, you don't have to wait for regulation to come from the top. You can actually build this into your value set of your company.
Absolutely. You need to be accountable for your actions in any jurisdiction, almost. There are laws, there's a set of rules, there are a set of practices, but it goes beyond that. It goes to the point of legitimacy. So if you want to exist as a business, if you big tech company, whoever you happen to be, you want to exist, you need the legitimacy to be confirmed by your stakeholders. And that means all of your stakeholders, not just your financiers. Your financiers can't consume your product. So you need the rest of society. So if you don't understand that basic equation, the social contract falls away and then you have a problem. Yes, you can ride the crest of the wave, and yes, you can make lots of money and make lots of personal gains, but that's not really responsible behavior. And there are too many things that are happening, too much ambiguity at the political level as well. This dual use that the executive order speaks about, the Biden administration executive order for AI, in contrast to the EU AI Act, but then that has been watered down. The UK, the jury is out, but it's about to do its own version of the EU AI Act. And other jurisdictions are also falling in line. But interestingly enough, after the protest, I think it was last summer, with all the artists and directors and everybody on the creative side saying enough is enough, finally, the US is trying to do something along the lines of protecting copyright and IP and saying that it should be in the hands of the creator. But if you take a big step back, this technology exists because human beings exist, because of our creativity, because we create the data, the inputs for it to exist. So I think big tech has to make a choice. Does it want to funnel the data in the direction of military experimentation and things that are happening along the lines of viruses and chemicals and eugenics and things that are happening which are not being particularly well managed? Do you want to contribute to that? Do you want to exploit people's data because ultimately it all ends up back in the same place and create those vulnerabilities for society at large? Because if we're using the same infrastructure, then the risks are very much greater. Or do you want to say, maybe we need to reconceive of this technology. Maybe we need smaller models. Maybe we need to decentralize the power. Maybe we can have a more powerful business if we do it differently. You can do it differently. There are different business models out there. They can be self-sustaining. I talk about the higher model in my book because I find it quite innovative in the way that they've gone about it. They've created a self-sustaining system whereby they seek to empower the people within the organization and also without the organization. So on the other side of the fence, the consumer. So everything is towards best practice, delivering a more economical refrigerator or more sustainable, repairing the path and so forth. But every single person in the ecosystem can elevate themselves. That's the point about that model. Whereas this idea that you can just impose your will on people, and that goes more to the coercive side of power, that's not sustainable because you'll end up with an implosion. And if you have an implosion, that's much more difficult to control than an explosion. That's the real risk. And we don't need AGI for that, or AI, in my opinion. It's a real risk right now that we need to manage more effectively and understand better.
When we spoke off air together, there was one thing that you mentioned a few times that stuck with me and that I really enjoyed, but maybe you could probably for our listeners, just as we come towards the end of today's discussion, you're pretty keen on mentioning that our relationship with technology should be synergistic rather than symbiotic. What do you mean by that?
Yeah, everybody talks about semantics, but I really believe in semantics. I'm a linguist by trade. Meaning is powerful in the words that you choose and you use. So synergy means that it's going to be mutually beneficial. I use technology in a way that best helps me be the best human being that I can be, to put it in simple terms, rather than I use technology so that I can have power over the next person. Now, in the past, you had absolute monarchies in history. You had the East India Company we spoke about. You have various forms of absolutism, let's say. And in each and every time, it fails. It falls apart. The Roman Empire fell apart and any empire after it. So we cannot now create a new empire, let's say, with technology, with AI, with the powers that it already has, because of the effect that it has on people. The manipulation, the persuasive dimensions, the misinformation, the disinformation. In that sense, it has power over people. we can't use that to then deny human autonomy and human agency. That's why I speak a lot about synergy rather than symbiotic, because symbiotic means that I win, we lose. It's a zero-sum game. It's one thing at the expense of the other. And we can't have technology at the expense of human intelligence and human consciousness and human values. And I think if we don't come to our senses sometime soon, it will get out of control in the sense that, not because it's AGI or ASI, you'd have to believe in panpsychism and that thing.
Right.
Which I don't, needless to say, but because of the effect that it has. So if in every aspect of our lives we have an AI filter, we're never really going to know what the truth is or what it isn't. We're always going to have another level of uncertainty. There's uncertainty, generally speaking, and there's chaos in the sense that we don't fully understand everything. We probably never will. Hence why we're human beings and we have intelligence. But we can't use that AI filter to create more symbiotic relationships, which are detrimental to one party or the other. It has to be a reconceptualization of the use of technology. And in that sense, synergy.
Yeah. Well, let me just
That
final
makes
question
sense.
on this. That makes perfect sense. Just final question. How optimistic are you that this vision that you've just laid out for us is a likely one?
Well, I think it's going to be a very difficult journey, but I do hold on to hope because I think there are many, many people out there who want to do the right thing. Maybe they don't know how. And maybe if we all get together and pull together and work in the right direction, we can turn this around for everybody's benefit, including big tech. It's not like I said, it doesn't have to be a zero-sum game. It doesn't have to be symbiotic. It can be synergistic. And that is not utopia. That's a possibility. That's reality. If we choose to live in the real world, because if we want to go off into some sci-fi virtual dimension, then it's not going to happen.
Well, and it seems that, as you were pointing out earlier, from the economic self-interest should drive big tech and other tech companies in the direction that you're talking about, or else you'll be left without consumers and without a real economy, which then could destroy even their assets and then their own value.
Yeah, and we are wired for self-preservation. We are wired for survival. And I think we need to just realize that we are interdependent upon nature. We are an integral part of nature. We're interdependent with and interconnected with the dynamics of nature. And we shouldn't be so arrogant as to believe that we can just keep exploiting, extracting, trying to change climate, whatever it is that we're attempting to do without consequences. And I think that's the real gap in our thinking, is that we are not thinking about the consequences as much as we should. If we do, then we can change. So to your question, I am hopeful because I do believe that we are beginning to understand some of the consequences and we're beginning to think about it. And so some of the research that I'm seeing going on and some of the even commentary that's going on, I think even among technologists, in that sense, I'm hopeful that people are beginning to say, enough is enough.
Yeah. Well, thank you, Maria. And I think I tend to agree with you. I think that we are coming at a point, and that's why when you have Goldman Sachs ask questions out loud about the viability of the model, then that there are some serious questions being asked elsewhere. And so when you have questions where you're in a moment of crisis in a way, then people start looking and become a bit more creative and perhaps also thinking a bit differently and moving away from existing paradigms. So I share with your cautious optimism and also hope that in fact we'll go in the right direction. Well, Maria, again, thank you so much. This has been very valuable. I really appreciate it. We'll have to have you back again, perhaps in a year's time, and see where we've been and where we are at the time. And of course, thank you to our listeners. We invite you to join us again next time for another discussion of law, society, and politics in the age of AI. Until then, stay human.